Well, I'm very happy to be here, this is a trip organized by the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development, ISCAT. And we basically have two missions, and I'll just say if we can turn the slide. Number one, we are here to look for good students to the ISCAT. And number two, we obviously want to engage with experts and officials like you to talk about some policy issues. So turn to the next slide. If you look at the ISCAT, which we represent, which was established in 2016, initially announced by the Chinese president in 2015 at the United Nations. And our school has three missions. Number one, to train leaders from developing countries. And number two, to do cutting-edge research on national development, to serve as a platform for exchange of ideas on South-South cooperation and development. And that's why we're here. I just mentioned that we have two specific tasks on this trip. Number one, find good students, especially the mid to senior high rank officials, to come to the Peking University to do a master or a PhD, a doctoral degree. If any of you are interested, either by yourself or your colleagues, please contact my colleague, Edward, and who's standing there. He is responsible for recruitment. And then I'll just turn to the next slides. The topic I like to talk about is probably related to development experiences and development models of developing countries, whether or not there is room for us to formulate what I call global South consensus. I'm sure you're all aware of the Washington Consensus, which was coined by the international organizations based in Washington, D.C. And they have a list of policy advices I put there that was originally from a paper done by John Williams, 10 principles about reform and development in developing countries. The key really is about a small government and a big market. That's the idea, to constrain the role of the government and to let market to work. I think in principle that probably was the right thing to follow or to advise. The problem is whether or not we can actually achieve these principles in most developing countries. If, for instance, the market is not perfect, can we just leave it to the market to decide on allocation and the pricing of the resources? And I think we find lots of problems if we just leave them to the market alone. A particular point I would argue today is that I think even the global north has abandoned the Washington Consensus. Look at what President Trump is doing with trade, with the industrial policy, and so on. I think they deviated, their policies also deviated from Washington Consensus. That certainly gives us, raised the question whether we should think something, while as I said, some principles are still useful for developing countries, but if there are ways of doing it in a more practical format. And I would start by highlighting three key challenges faced by the global South. Number one is development, and I think this is the utmost question that we all face. The World Bank coined this term, the middle income trap. Many developing countries stay as a low-income country or middle-income country, but very difficult to rise higher. But some of the economies succeeded during the last 60, 70 years, especially the Asian tigers. Japan for Asian tigers, and China, I think they're on the rise quite successfully. But I can remind you, and you probably remember, when these economies were doing well, they were frequently criticized by international organizations for instance, too much government intervention, for industrial policy and so on. So I think this raises a small question about what really is useful for developing countries if our goal is to achieve economic development. And I think that the Asian success story really shows maybe there's some room for combination between market and the government. And that's something I think we should think about. The second thing I think which is also very important is the environment for cooperation is probably changing. When the Asian tigers, when China was on the rise, the global market was very open. And we could freely participate in international division of labor. Like China, when they started economic reform in 1978, we had a cheap cost. But if we were able to put together, produce some products, we were competitive in the international market because the cost was so low. But the assumption is that you can sell it to the international market without much barriers. That environment is changing, and I'm sure you would all agree. Trade protectionism is rising, and this poses additional challenge for the global South. The third challenge is technology. Technology in general is good for growth potential, and I put a chart here, but I don't have time to get into it. What I'm saying here, using the UK data to show that the growth potential of GDP per capita was around 0 400 years ago. Now it's about 2%, which means after 400 years, the growth potential, the trend growth of the United Kingdom actually increased. What happened in between? 3 to 4 industrial revolutions. When industrial revolutions happen, you lift the growth potential, you accelerate actually growth. And that certainly raises a question for developing countries. Can we grasp the opportunity to make it a better growth potential? But at the same time, I would also argue technology might not always work in favor of the global South, because if the global North can utilize technology to mitigate the rising labor cost, because our advantage is cheap labor cost, and if they can use AI to replace workers, then maybe the opportunity for developing countries could decline instead of increase. That's additional challenge we face. And then I'd like to discuss a bit about how to achieve economic growth, and I mentioned the Washington Consensus. But last year, the Nobel Prize was awarded to 3 economists led by Professor Asmigolo from MIT. Their key thesis about economic growth is basically they say good institutions are positive for long-run growth. As economists, we all would agree. And I think as we heard earlier, building efficient, effective institutions is very important. The problem is, can we build effective, efficient institutions overnight in developing countries? If we cannot, what happens? And I think if you look at the Chinese experience, China is a developing country, but also is a transition economy. We used to have a central planned system, and we are moving toward a free market system. We are still in the process of transition. About 30 years ago, there was a big debate. How do you transit from a central planned system to a market economy? Professor Jeffrey Sachs, at the time he was at Harvard, his argument was the best approach is shock therapy, just to jump to the market economy. And that obviously sounds like the right theory, but in practice, it's very difficult to achieve. We shut down all the central planning mechanism. When we wake up tomorrow, can we see an efficient and effective market? Probably not. You look at the experience of the former Soviet Union. The Chinese approach is called gradualism. We move gradually, and we even adopted this dual-track system. We maintain some older system, but let the new system grow, expand. And that's how the economy start to grow more rapidly. So I put also the picture of another a Chinese professor there, Professor Qian Yingyi, who has done quite a lot of work on the gradualism, on the dual track system reform. So in addition to what if I call that original Nobel Prize theory about economic growth just now, I like to present what my colleagues at the ISCAD presented or proposed during the past couple of decades. Professor Zhou Qiren, Professor Justin Lin, who was the founding dean of the ISCAD and was also the former chief economist at the World Bank, and my colleague also Professor Zhang Weiying. I don't have time to get into it, but if I summarize their views, and I must say their views are also different, they debate with each other. But the essence of the summary of our thesis is that number one, you need to have a very clear objective that you're moving toward a market economy. That should be clear. At the end of the day, you need a market to decide the allocation and the pricing of the resources. But again, it's very important. If that's the goal, you might not be able to achieve it tomorrow. If you leave everything to the market, what you saw from the former Soviet Union, what you immediately saw jumping of the unemployment rate, collapsing of the GDP, because the new system takes a long time to develop and evolve. The Chinese approach, you realize, in most developing countries, you cannot have a perfect market in the short term. Therefore, that means the governments need to be practical and pragmatic. If the market is not perfect, then the government needs to play a role. The Chinese reform, and as we heard earlier on, participation in international division of labor is very important. In fact, the one very simple policy which worked at the beginning in China was to let some people to get rich first, which means if you work harder, you should be rewarded. And that's the beginning of lots of people working very hard, jobs created, poverty alleviated. And I think, but what you need is to provide the necessary conditions for the entrepreneurs, for the workers to work hard and get to the result. That condition could be market mechanism. That is still very important. But if the market mechanism is not perfect, the government should provide some assistance in making sure this allocation pricing works. And the government also needed to do lots of things on education, infrastructure, and so on. So I think pragmatism and a combination of an efficient market and a proactive government. But let me say, emphasize, government role is to facilitate and make sure the market works. It's not to replace the rules of the market. That is very important. And again, there are lots of discussions about China's industrial policy, and we already heard the automobile industry. In fact, the EV sector, electronic industry, work quite well. If you talk to people from the US and Europe, they will tell you the Chinese EV sector was mainly built on industrial policy, state subsidy. My take is the government certainly had an industrial policy starting from 3 decades ago. So they had a long-term planning. But the state subsidy was only a small part of the story. In fact, most of the very successful automobile companies competing in international markets today are almost all privately owned. And if you look at, for instance, the 2 charts here, the left chart basically when the size of the industry expand, efficiency improved significantly. So there was an obvious scale efficiency. If you look at the left-hand side, we probably had some overcapacity at some stage in some market, but you look at the red bar shows the exit of the companies. And the blue bar shows the entry of the companies. And you find during the past couple of years, a lot of companies exiting from that space. and less and less coming in. So the industry is already consolidating, which means the market is working. So as I said, the government played an important role, but the rule should not interfere with operation of the market. What we call is, it helps to overcome market failure. It helps to overcome market imperfection, not to replace the market. That, I think, is very important. AI opportunity, I just mentioned it could be something we should look at in developing countries. But the Jensen Huang, I'm not sure if you heard about him, NVIDIA, a founder and a CEO. He said one thing which I thought was very impressive. He said, you look at the industrial revolutions in history, the countries often benefit most from industrial revolution were not necessarily the countries invented new technology, but the countries can apply the new technology faster and better. And some people use the second industrial revolution as an example. It was invented mainly in the UK and Germany, but the US benefited most from that industrial revolution. And I think it offers an opportunity for us to look at the opportunity of AI technology and see if we can benefit from there. The technology might not be invented by us, but if we can apply well, it could both raise our growth potential here. And KPMG recently did a survey which shows, in fact, the adoption rate of the AI technology is much higher in emerging market economies than in developed world. Here I have a number for South Africa here, and I think I can't see the number, but 82%. In the US, it's 53%. That offers some opportunity for us to look at. International economic order, the environment is changing, but the point is, can the global southern countries work together to sustain some kind of openness in the international trading regime? And I mentioned that the US is adopting lots of trade protectionism and the trade protection policies. But even in advanced countries, there are strong interest in an open trade system. And I can certainly see European Union, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, even Canada. I think that their growth model is more dependent on the openness of the economy. So there are a significant group of countries in the world to sustaining the open trading system. If we can work on it, especially among the global south countries, then we can continue to benefit from the international division of labor. So finally, I just would like to summarize, and I like to propose to you, this is something we like to work with you, to see if there is room to formulate what we call a global South consensus. I'm not saying that the principles of relying on the market was wrong, but the global South consensus would build more on the fact that conditions in developing countries are different from the developed countries. If we just leave it to the market, it might not generate what you expect. And this is why we need to be pragmatic. So the rationale or considerations. Number one, as I said, I think the global north even has abandoned some of the principles they proposed in the Washington consensus. And number two, the market often is not perfect, especially in developing countries. Market failure often happens. In that case, we should focus on what the government should do to facilitate, to improve the market mechanism. Number four, I think if we look at, for instance, number three, if we look at the economic indicators, growth is very important. But growth is not everything. We need to look at employment, equality, stability, sometimes even national security, and so on. Finally, I think for reform, we all need to move forward, but the pragmatism, I think, is key for us to achieve what we need. So what should be the key elements? As I said, we'd like to discuss with you and many other experts from developing countries, from the global south. But I will propose to start the discussion. First, I think we should aim at eventually market playing decisive roles responsible for allocation and pricing of the resources. That's very important. Resources meaning factors and products. And number two, liberalization is important, trade investment, because that allows us to participate in international division of labor. If we have lots of resources, if we're not open, then will not be valued at the international market. That actually will depress your income. So open is very important, but the prudent liberalization is the key. We can't just say opening is good, then we will open it. And I can tell you from Asia, many countries liberalized their capital account, and in the following year, they experienced the financial crisis. So careful, prudent liberalization is important. And number three, as I said, the pragmatic policy approach is very important. If we design some policy, it needs to meet the feasibility requirement. I think the shock therapy theory was good, optimal, but only on paper, because you can't jump to a market economy overnight. So you can't actually have a shock therapy. That's why gradualism might be more pragmatic. And we need to be checked always with the outcome. Number four, I think it's very important, as my colleague, Professor Justin, or the founding dean of the school, always argue, economic development is a process of structural upgrading. We need to move from low end to high end, but how do we move? Here, the market plays a role, entrepreneurship plays a role, maybe the government can also play a role through industrial policy. As I said, the Chinese industrial policy, the Chinese government adopted lots of industrial policies, but I can tell you, not all of them succeeded. And in fact, I will say a lot of them failed. The industrial policies succeeded, often because, number one, they're trying to overcome the market failure, not to replace the market. Number two, they also focus on letting the private sector play a bigger role in the development, especially in innovation. And number three, whatever industrial policy you adopt, you should not prevent competition. And you should have a time period when the industrial policy will exit. Otherwise, it becomes a permanent protection. The indigenous, the infant industry policy you probably heard before was not very successful. Number five, I think developing countries should pay greater attention to the new technology which is emerging, because that gives us the opportunity of catching up through the curve. We might jump forward in our development. And finally, I think growth is very important. That's what we're trying to achieve. But in today's world, we need to pay also attention. Growth is important, but it's not everything. We need to pay attention to employment, equality, stability, and even security. These support economic resilience. So these are the tentative ideas I like to propose and present to you, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss, many of you, including Professor Bosani, if we can reach an agreement on the necessary elements of a global South consensus, then we'll be able to just release it, and the developing countries can look at it, see if any of it would be useful for them. Thank you very much for your time.